Right now, somewhere on the African continent, there are two people living a few hundred miles apart from each other. To almost anyone glancing at them, they'd look like they belong to the same race. Same general skin tone, same continent, same broad category most of us were taught to sort people into without a second thought. But here's the twist. Genetically speaking, those two people can be more different from one another than a man from Oslo is from a woman in Tokyo. Read that again, because it sounds almost impossible. And once you understand why it's true, it doesn't just complicate the idea of race, it completely rewrites it. This story starts 300,000 years ago in a corner of Africa that scientists didn't even know mattered until fairly recently. And it ends with a question that most of us have never actually stopped to ask ourselves. Where do we really come from? And does the map in our heads even resemble the truth? For almost all of recorded history, humans have sorted each other using the simplest tool available, our eyes. Skin color, hair texture, the shape of a nose or a cheekbone. It felt natural, automatic, obvious. In the same way it once felt obvious that the sun crawled across the sky while the earth sat still beneath it. And for a long stretch of time, science didn't push back on that instinct. It actually reinforced it. In the early 1800s, an American physician named Samuel Morton turned this instinct into what he believed was a scientific system. He spent years collecting human skulls, hundreds of them, pulled from old battlefields, cemeteries, and places where nobody was likely to ask too many questions about consent. His method was almost absurdly simple. He'd pack each skull with seeds, and later switch to lead pellets, pour the filling back out, and measure the volume. In his mind, a bigger skull meant a bigger brain, and a bigger brain meant a more advanced race. Using nothing more sophisticated than seeds and a scale, he ranked entire populations of human beings against one another. To be fair to Morton, in a strange sort of way, he wasn't necessarily acting out of pure malice. He was working in an era before anyone understood evolution, decades before the concept of a gene even existed, let alone the tools to study one. So he built a hierarchy out of raw guesswork and dressed it up as science. And that hierarchy didn't stay locked away in some dusty archive. It got weaponized. It was cited to justify slavery, it shaped legislation, and it handed a scientific-sounding excuse to some of the darkest episodes in modern history. The notion that race was carved into the body the same way height or eye color is, fixed, permanent, biological, became so deeply woven into the way people thought that almost nobody questioned it for generations. Then DNA entered the picture. Once scientists learned how to actually read the code tucked inside our cells, the four-letter alphabet that spells out the blueprint for a human being, some of them expected to find Morton's old hierarchy hiding somewhere in there. Clean genetic boundaries, distinct signatures that separated one race from another, a biological stamp for every category humanity had invented. What they actually found was almost the exact opposite. In the year 2000, the world watched as the first rough draft of the complete human genome was unveiled at a ceremony inside the White House. It was treated as a landmark achievement, the kind of moment people compared to the moon landing. One of the researchers behind that breakthrough, Craig Venter, stood in front of the cameras and said something that quietly pulled the foundation out from under the entire concept of race, as science had defined it. He stated plainly that the idea of race has no genetic basis whatsoever, not a smaller basis than people assumed, not a shakier one, but none at all. That line alone is startling. But the actual data behind it is even stranger, because it isn't simply that race lacks genetic support. The genome doesn't just fail to confirm the racial map most of us grew up with, it actively contradicts it. And here's where those two people standing a few hundred miles apart in Africa come back into the picture. If race really did function as a biological category, the way a species or a subspecies functions, you would expect the largest genetic gulfs on the planet to sit between the groups we've traditionally labeled as separate races. Europeans compared to Africans, Asians compared to Europeans. That's the exact picture Morton was chasing with his collection of skulls, and it's still the picture most people carry around without ever really examining it. But once geneticists mapped out where the true oldest divisions in the human family tree actually sit, that whole picture collapsed. The deepest splits on Earth, the oldest branch points in the entire human story, aren't found between what we casually call different races at all. They sit between different populations inside Africa itself. Groups like the Khoisan peoples of southern Africa and the various pygmy populations of Central Africa split away from the rest of humanity and from one another tens of thousands of years before a single person ever left the continent. These lineages have remained distinct and isolated for so long that the genetic distance separating them dwarfs the distance between, say, someone from northern China and someone from Scandinavia. Sit with that for a second, because it flips the old racial hierarchy completely on its head. In the traditional picture, African gets treated as a single branch sitting next to European and Asian, as if the three were roughly equal limbs on the same tree. The actual tree doesn't look anything like that. Nearly the entire non-African world, every European, every Asian, every indigenous American, every Pacific Islander, descends from one comparatively narrow branch that broke away from African populations, somewhere between 50 and 70,000 years ago, and then spread out to fill the rest of the planet. Meanwhile, inside Africa, several ancient branches have remained separate for far longer than that. The Khoisan lineage alone may trace back roughly 100,000 years or more, based on current genetic dating methods. Which means those two people, standing a few hundred miles apart, both of whom an outsider would lazily lump into a single racial box, can genuinely carry more distinct, more ancient, more deeply diverged genetic histories between them than the combined histories of every person whose ancestors left Africa together and eventually populated Europe and Asia. The category African ends up doing something almost backward from what most people assume. It isn't the narrowest, most closely related branch on the tree. In genetic terms, it's the widest, oldest, and most internally diverse branch that exists, and every other population on the planet is just a smaller, younger twig growing off one section of it. Let that idea sit for a moment, because it reframes something fundamental. In a very literal sense, every human alive today is African. Not in some symbolic or cultural way, but in terms of raw ancestry. Homo sapiens as a species first appeared somewhere on the African continent, and current fossil evidence, including a striking discovery out of Morocco, pushes the earliest signs of anatomically modern humans back as far as 300,000 years. For roughly 200,000 of those years, while modern humans were already walking the earth, we remained almost entirely confined to Africa. And even during that enormous stretch of time, long before anyone crossed into the Middle East, Europe, or Asia, populations within Africa were already splitting apart, migrating into different regions of the continent and drifting into isolation from one another. Those internal African splits form the oldest branches on the entire human family tree. And they happened long before race, in the modern sense, existed as an idea anyone could have applied. So if the deepest, oldest divisions within humanity aren't between the racial groups we discussed today, where did those categories actually come from? The honest answer points to recent geography, not ancient biology. It comes down to the way small groups that left Africa later became cut off from each other for relatively short windows of time. When a small population moves into a new environment and stays isolated from other groups for thousands of years, random mutations start to build up. Some of those mutations affect visible characteristics, skin tone adjusting to match local sunlight levels, changes in eye shape, hair texture, bone structure. Over many generations, those visible differences became the exact traits people use to sort each other into categories. But visible traits make up a tiny, almost negligible slice of the genome. It's a bit like judging two books purely by the color of their covers while completely ignoring that one book is 400 pages longer, structured completely differently, and contains whole chapters the other doesn't even have. This is really the core discovery that came out of the Human Genome Project, once its first phase wrapped up. On average, human beings are about 99.9% identical to one another at the level of raw DNA, regardless of which continent their ancestors happen to come from. That's an almost absurdly narrow margin of difference. It means there's more genetic variation sitting inside what we casually call a single race than there is between supposedly different races. Two random people who would both be labeled white on a census form can be more genetically different from each other than one of them is from someone labeled Asian. Skin color and a small handful of other visible traits are governed by a relatively small number of genes that happen to respond quickly to environmental pressure, particularly sunlight exposure. But those genes represent a rounding error compared to the full scope of the genome, and they don't line up cleanly with the deeper, slower-moving patterns of ancestry that actually tell the real story of human migration. Formally speaking, biologists have a specific term for genetically distinct populations existing within a single species. It's called a subspecies. Wolves have recognized subspecies, tigers have recognized subspecies, plenty of animals across the natural world do. But when researchers went looking for that kind of clean, physically and genetically distinguishable subdivision within Homo sapiens, they came up empty. As a species, we simply don't split into subspecies. Every human population blends gradually into its neighboring populations through continuous, gradual variation, not through sharp genetic borders. There's no line on any map where one race's DNA stops and another's begins, because that line was never actually there. What exists instead is a gradient, a slow smear of genetic variation that runs thickest and richest across Africa and gradually thins out and becomes more uniform the farther you trace human migration outward. That happens because every population founded outside of Africa started from a smaller, less diverse founding group than the population it left behind, and this isn't some outdated finding from the year 2000 either. Researchers keep confirming it, using bigger data sets and sharper tools right up to the present moment. One of the more striking recent confirmations comes from a massive study built on the All of Us research program, a genetic and health database backed by the National Institutes of Health, designed to sequence genomes drawn from a huge and genuinely diverse cross-section of people living across the United States. A team led by genetic epidemiologist Charles Rotimi analyzed roughly 2 million genetic variants across more than 230,000 participants. What they set out to check was straightforward enough to describe, and the results were fascinating. Does the race or ethnicity people report about themselves actually correspond to clean, distinct genetic clusters? It didn't. Rather than splitting neatly into the racial categories people had checked off on a form, most participants' genomes revealed broad, overlapping gradients of ancestry stretching across multiple continents at once. People who identified as Black or African American showed wildly different proportions of African and European ancestry from one another, not some single uniform genetic signature. And the pattern grew even more dramatic among participants who declined to select any racial category at all. More than 90% of that particular group identified as Hispanic or Latino, and their DNA reflected a genuinely sweeping mixture of African, European, and Native American ancestry all layered together, a mixture that no single checkbox on any form could ever hope to capture accurately. A bioethicist who reviewed the study made a point that cut straight to the heart of all this. She argued that researchers should stop defaulting to broad continental categories because those categories are, in her own words, artificial rather than simply imprecise, built more for administrative convenience than for biological accuracy. And this isn't some fringe opinion floating on the edges of the field. It has become close to a consensus position among population geneticists, most of whom have quietly stepped away from using the word race as a scientific label at all in recent years, replacing it instead with more precise language centered on ancestry, migration history, and regional genetic variation. None of this means that self-reported race is meaningless as a concept, and it would be dishonest to skip past that nuance. Race is real as a social category, real in the sense that it shapes how people get treated, which neighborhoods they grow up in, what quality of healthcare they receive, and what kinds of discrimination they encounter across their lives. Those social realities leave genuine fingerprints on health outcomes, on stress levels, on access to resources of every kind. And researchers studying disease and public health still find self-reported race genuinely useful, precisely because it captures those social and environmental factors, things that pure genetic ancestry data simply can't see on its own. The mistake isn't in acknowledging that race shapes lived experience. The mistake is assuming that lived experience maps cleanly onto some fixed, ancient biological category, when the genome itself tells a far messier and far more interesting story. And that story gets even stranger once you zoom out from modern humans altogether and look further back into our deeper past. Because the version of human history most of us absorb growing up, one lone species slowly evolving and gradually spreading out to fill the planet, turns out to be a little off. For most of the time anatomically modern humans have existed, we weren't alone. We shared this planet with other kinds of humans, species with their own tools, their own migrations, their own family lines. It's only in roughly the last 30,000 years, genuinely a blink of an eye on an evolutionary timescale, that Homo sapiens has been the sole surviving human species on Earth. Before that, across a span stretching hundreds of thousands of years, several distinct kinds of humans coexisted, sometimes overlapping in the same regions, occasionally even sheltering in the very same caves. The first hard proof of this arrived in 2009, when scientists managed to extract enough genetic material from ancient Neanderthal bone to sequence a complete genome belonging to a human species other than our own. That sequence finally answered a question that had haunted paleontologists for generations. Did modern humans and Neanderthals actually interbreed whenever their paths crossed? The genome gave a clear, unambiguous answer. Yes, they did. Neanderthal DNA carries traces of Homo sapiens ancestry, and Homo sapiens DNA carries traces of Neanderthal ancestry in return. On average, people of European descent carry somewhere between 1% and 2% Neanderthal ancestry sitting quietly inside their genome right now, a genetic souvenir passed down from encounters that happened tens of thousands of years ago. Then, barely a year later, the story turned even more surreal. Inside a cave in Russia called Denisova, researchers uncovered a tiny fragment of bone, the tip of a finger, along with a single molar tooth, both belonging to a teenage girl who had died there long ago. That was enough material to extract a complete genome, and when scientists compared it against both modern humans and Neanderthals, it matched neither. It belonged to something else entirely, a previously unknown branch of the human family tree, now referred to as the Denisovans. Like the Neanderthals before them, they interbred with our ancestors too. And the genetic evidence of that mixing is written directly into the DNA of people alive on Earth right now. Interestingly, the geographic pattern of that inherited ancestry isn't uniform at all. The further east you travel across Asia and out into the Pacific, the more Denisovan ancestry shows up in modern populations, and the less Neanderthal ancestry appears, a genetic echo marking almost exactly where and when those ancient encounters actually took place. But here's the detail that really rewrites the entire picture, the one that reportedly surprised even the researchers studying it. When scientists compared how much Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA modern humans actually carry, the totals didn't fully add up. There was more unexplained genetic variation floating around in the human genome than mixing with just those two known groups could account for. That gap points to something both unsettling and genuinely thrilling at the same time: the likely existence of at least one more archaic human species that our ancestors interbred with, one for which we currently have no bones, no fossils, no physical trace whatsoever. Its only evidence is a kind of shadow, a statistical ghost hiding inside the DNA of people living today. We don't know what it looked like. We don't even have a name for it, because it never received one. But it's in us anyway, an entire lost species, surviving only as scattered fragments spread throughout the genomes of its distant hybrid descendants. Geneticists doing this kind of work sometimes describe it as genetic archaeology, and honestly, that's exactly what it amounts to. Instead of digging through soil looking for bones and tools, they're digging through the genome itself, searching for traces of populations that left behind no other record at all. Researchers involved in this field have pointed out that even after sequencing something on the order of 100,000 human genomes and building increasingly sophisticated tools to analyze all that variation, the deeper they dig, the more hidden stories keep surfacing. Every new dataset seems to reveal another layer of mixing, another lost population, another migration nobody had ever documented, another piece of evidence that human history was never a single, clean line running from point A to point B. It was always a tangle. This tangle shows up in more recent, subtler ways too, not just through ancient interbreeding, but through the different environments various populations settled into after leaving Africa. When farming emerged somewhere around 10 to 12,000 years ago, it didn't just change what humans ate, it began reshaping human biology itself. The clearest example of this is something called lactase persistence, the ability to comfortably digest milk sugar well into adulthood. Most mammals, humans included, historically lose that ability shortly after weaning. But in populations that domesticated dairy animals and built milk into their diet across many generations, a genetic mutation allowing adults to keep digesting milk spread rapidly because it offered a genuine survival advantage. Today, most people of European descent carry that mutation, while most people worldwide still don't. A difference that has absolutely nothing to do with any ancient racial hierarchy, and everything to do with which specific population happened to start herding cattle and drinking milk a few thousand years ago. There's an even more extreme, more recent example of just how quickly the human genome can respond to a specific environment. On an Indonesian island near a cave, where the remains of a separate extinct human species called Homo floresiensis were once discovered, a population of modern humans living nearby also evolved unusually short stature, apparently completely independently and unrelated to the ancient species that once inhabited that exact same cave. It's a striking coincidence, two entirely different human lineages, separated by tens of thousands of years, both arriving at small body size as an adaptation to the exact same island environment. A reminder that evolution keeps landing on similar solutions to similar pressures over and over again, regardless of ancestry or what people would casually call race.